Good evening, everyone. I'm Chuck Rybak, and thank you for tuning into our third episode of No Reservations, a conversation series designed to provide a forum for sharing bold, challenging, and even provocative ideas. We are coming to you live from UW Green Bay's Fort Howard Hall at the Weidner Center for the Performing Arts. I'm really excited about tonight's guest. Michelle McQuade Dewhirst received a bachelor's degree in music education and horn performance from Ithaca College and completed her master's and doctoral degrees in music composition at the University of Chicago. As professor of music at UW Green Bay, she teaches courses in music theory and history, composition, horn, and popular music. Her music has been performed across the country by such ensembles as the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, the Pacifica String Quartet, and 8th Blackbird. She's a founding member of a very small consortium, an ensemble dedicated to the performance of miniatures that last 1 minute or less, or that consist of 100 or fewer notes. In September of 2015, she embarked on the Piano Per Diem project, for which she composed one new work for piano each day for 30 days. An active and versatile horn player, Michelle is currently principal horn with the Weidner Philharmonic and the Manitowoc Symphony. Professor Dewhirst will give a brief talk on her recent work, which is amazing, and you'll get some samples of. And then we will move to the question and answer portion. And so, like always, please post any questions that you have in the chat. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle McQuade Dewhirst.
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you to all of you for tuning in. As Chuck mentioned, I am a composer and a horn player. My last horn playing gig before the pandemic shut everything down was on March 7th, 2020. I performed at the Meyer Theater in downtown Green Bay with Vic Ferrari and Symphony on the Rocks. My husband plays in the group as well, and we call these gigs rock band date night. A few of us made reference to COVID-19 in our conversations that night, but of course none of us really had any idea what was coming. After the show, we went to a bar down the street. I was introduced to a stranger, and I shook his hand. We laughed and said, "Should we be doing this?" That was the last hand I shook for a year. As we left the bar, I probably said, "See you next weekend," to at least half a dozen members of the ensemble. I did not see them the next weekend, because over the course of the following week, every performance commitment we all had for the foreseeable future had fallen like dominoes. We've all experienced varying degrees of isolation during the pandemic. The particular isolation of a musician during the pandemic has been twofold. Working in music is a lifestyle as much as a career, because so much of a performer's social life is centered around their gigs, hanging out before and hanging out after. We lost both the work we love and the social connections around that work. I've missed the work, but I've missed the connections that performers make while playing together and the connections that we all make with our audiences even more. Pandemic shutdowns have forced artists and presenters alike to grapple with the same questions simultaneously and urgently. Now what do we do? What can we do now that our primary tools, our venues and in-person collaborations have been taken away from us? How can we stay connected in spite of everything? How can we connect with each other and with our audiences without the tools we're used to using? I decided early on that being invisible was not an option, that our music program, for example, had to find ways to share something, anything, with our audience. And my colleagues and I have worked hard over this academic year to try to bring these things to life. Later, as the initial shock of pandemic upheaval began to wear off and as opportunities began to present themselves, I began to write music again after some time off, after a period of stunned silence. As I look at these works, I see that they're tied together in two ways. Each work represents an attempt to solve some kind of practical problem related to sharing music during the pandemic. And each represents an attempt on my part to process the ways in which our sense of time has felt strange and distorted for the past year. I'm going to talk about 3 compositions, and I'll share a brief excerpt from each one. If you're interested in hearing full performances of these works, links to each of the 3 pieces I'll be discussing are in the comments, or the information section rather, on this YouTube event. The first piece I'll discuss is called Time Lapse. It was a bit of a spontaneous reaction to a Facebook post made by my friend Brian Hazlett. Brian is a cellist who teaches at the New World School of the Arts in Florida and performs with soprano Jocelyn Zelasco in a fantastic duo called Juxtatonal. When students all over the world were forced to scatter during the pandemic, their teachers were forced to figure out ways of finishing out the school year online. Zoom calls and asynchronous online courses were the solution for many, but teaching and performing music online poses unique challenges. Simply put, there's simply too much of a lag in a Zoom call to allow musicians to play simultaneously in a coordinated way. If you've celebrated a birthday over Zoom and sung happy birthday with a group, you've probably experienced this lag. So when Brian asked if anyone knew of pieces that his cello students could play together from a distance, it occurred to me that given the right material, performers could sort of lean into the problem by playing music that does not have to line up in a precise way. That idea led me to having the first musical idea I'd had in months. I wrote a single line of melody and told Brian that one player could start playing the melody at any pace they liked. A second player could begin when the first player reached a certain note of that melody, and any number of additional players could enter one by one. The result of this approach is intended to be a swirl of sound with no strict pulse as each individual works their way through the melody. The title refers to a lapsed and lonely sense of time. Here now is a brief excerpt of Time Lapse. In December of 2020, my longtime friend and musical collaborator Michael Hall connected me with the Alma Ensemble, a Virginia-based trio. Sarah Wardle-Jones on flute, Michelle Smith-Johnson on clarinet, and Erica Sipes on piano. Michael, who I would hire as my agent if I could afford him, suggested me to the group when they were looking for a composer to accept a bit of a challenging commission. The trio had been asked to perform a live stream concert at the end of January 2021 at a venue called The Spot on Kirk in Roanoke, Virginia. But there was a catch. The performance space was far too small for the trio to be able to perform together live safely. The challenge here was this: how to write a piece for a live performance when only the pianist could perform live. It was clear from the beginning that Sarah and Michelle would have to pre-record the flute and clarinet parts, but how would Erica's piano part connect to those parts? I only briefly considered using a click track, a device commonly used in all kinds of musical contexts, to help performers keep the same tempo, but I found the notion of creating a rigidly structured and pulsed piece difficult to contemplate while time itself felt so distorted. Together, the trio and I settled on the following solution. As I did with Time Lapse, I wrote the trio piece in such a way that most ideas did not have to lock together in a precise way. I took Sarah and Michelle's recordings of their parts and pieced them together in audio editing software, creating a track for Erica to perform with. From there, I gave Erica some timings within that recording as landmarks. She used a stopwatch during the performance to keep track of the relationship between her music and the recording. As long as she was able to find those landmarks, the details of coordination between the parts could be loose. In fact, some of the gestures in the woodwind parts are written to have a free and improvisatory feel, while the piano part is moving at a steadier tempo. In these moments, the piano part represents a conventional understanding of time being measured in regular and predictable increments, while the woodwind parts go off the grid. They blur the boundaries of our sense of time. The piece is called Blur, and here now is a brief excerpt. I'll talk now about one more piece, a work for solo viola called Zing Boom. I wrote this for my friend Michael Hall, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. Michael Hall is based in Chicago and is an internationally renowned champion of new music. He's also a co-founder of the Bandung Philharmonic, the first symphony orchestra in Indonesia. A frequent world traveler, Michael found himself without travel plans for what I imagine is the longest stretch of his performing career. One of his solutions to adapt to the current moment was to partner with Chicago-based pianist Marianne Parker. Together, they've been working on producing live-streamed concerts. As I mentioned earlier, performers have been missing our connections with audience as much, if not more, than the performing work itself. Live streams are great, but they are limited. The audience's senses are not engaged as directly. Everything is mediated through a screen. Michael and Marianne came up with an ingenious solution that allowed their performances to engage different senses for the audience. They created wine and chocolate tasting kits to be paired with their performances. I was thrilled when Michael asked me to write him a brief and upbeat solo viola piece for the duo's Valentine's Day live stream. The Valentine theme was my first creative prompt, and as we discussed our plans, I quickly got a second prompt. My piece was to be paired with an Aztec truffle featuring habanero and cayenne pepper. So clearly I needed to write something spicy. I combined these ideas and wrote a piece that tries to capture the nervous excitement of new beginnings. Sometimes we rush headlong into them, sometimes we hang back with trepidation, sometimes we do both of those things in the same day or even the same moment. That line of thinking reminded me of a favorite recording by one of my favorite artists, Bjork. The song, It's Oh So Quiet, does exactly this. The shifting energy of that song raucously celebrates the new beginnings of a love affair and then pulls back with every moment of heartbreak. The title Zing Boom comes from one of the celebratory lines of the song. Here's a brief excerpt from Zing Boom. The shifting energy of Zing Boom also now seems to represent my state of mind as we start to contemplate the end of the pandemic. I'm optimistic. I believe opportunities to connect and perform are on their way back. But we're not quite at a moment where we can rush headlong into these opportunities. Time still feels strange, and I'm not sure when it won't. There's going to be a period of awkward adjustment, and I'm not sure we'll ever be going back to what we thought was normal. We're going to be figuring out what the new normal is for quite some time. However, I do feel certain of one thing, that when musicians and audiences begin to gather safely and more regularly, we will continue to rediscover new ways of connecting. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us too. I'm really excited about this because I'm a huge fan on top of it. So
Thank you.
in looking at the first question I was going to ask you was sent in by somebody from the chat already, so there's already symmetry here. But you know, in leading up to this, I brought questions. I have them on paper, and trying to think about the difference between talking to somebody who's an artist and asking somebody about their scholarly work as if they're different things somehow, but they're not, right? And so here's a kind of an easy way in, and I've spent the last week listening to the pieces over and over again. And I've noticed that when I just hit replay, you don't get credit for a viewing on that. So you have like 5,000 views on one, where it's much lower than that right now. I just want you to know that I was there,
okay,
and I was doing work, okay? But it seems that people reach out to you frequently to compose work, which must be a huge compliment for one. But where does the process start for you? And this was asked better online, which was, where does the process for your composing start, and where does inspiration come from? I was thinking about things like poetry, where, okay, maybe it's an image or something, or if you're writing a paper, hey, I had a question, and this is where I went. So where does it start for you, and how does that work?
Right. It's a hard thing to pin down, because I really think inspiration can come from anywhere, and sometimes very unlikely sources. And every piece has, I guess, a slightly different origin story. Mm-hmm. When I haven't been commissioned, when it has come fully from me, this impulse to write something, it starts often with the combination of a concept and a player who I'd like to write for. Mm-hmm. And trying to match the concept to the player is part of the process. Sometimes it's text that I want to find meaning in, or reflect the meaning of. I don't do well when I go looking for text. It's better when text finds me.
And you do have, I mean, your record is, you've done a lot of different things, but you do have a history of taking literary texts and then composing pieces for them.
Yeah, I love that process, and I've been very fortunate to work with singers who are really receptive to the things that I've been doing, and that's really fun. And sometimes these texts have lofty ideas being expressed in them, and sometimes they're spam emails, and it just it depends on the context. It depends on what strikes me. When it's a commission, there's often some starting point that the commissioner is coming from. Mm-hmm. And so in the case of the piece from Michael Hall, he definitely wanted something upbeat. He wanted something that would match this Valentine's theme. He talked about love and first romance and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And that idea of new beginnings came from that initial prompt.
So before I forget this, this is a selfish question, that thinking of the piece that Michael played, that is there he's bouncing I'm going to get the terms wrong, he's bouncing the bow on the strings, mm-hmm. and there's got to be a name for that, right? Do you write that in, or is that him, having listened to other pieces that you've composed where mm-hmm. somebody would interpret that, is he interpreting that, or is he playing it the way that your master plan was all laid out?
There's a combination there, mm-hmm. Because some music is notated in such an extremely precise way that there's not a lot of room for flexible interpretation. I tend not to write that way. I tend to write phrases that can be more flexibly interpreted. And so Michael and I actually are still having a little bit of back and forth as he continues to work on the piece, and he's asking me, how do you like this shaping? And we talk about these things. So my notation is meant to send a performer in a particular direction, but I'm never against a different interpretation of that, as long as we're all sort of still speaking the same language.
Yeah. So again, like if I refer back to, I mean, because you're an artist, but to me that's no different than being a scholar, that they're synonymous, right, in that way. And if somebody who was a traditional academic, let's say, was sitting in the chair, I don't think I would ask somebody, are you an experimental scholar? It's not really a question that I've asked much, but I could ask you, are you an experimental artist? And it makes me want to ask more people, are you an experimental scholar? So are you an experimental scholar and artist?
It's an interesting thing. I think I need to make a distinction between what I consider to be experimentation for myself within my own work and what experimental means in the broader musical community.
Because you're so radical.
Well, no,
All right.
kind of the opposite, right? Like I cannot claim to have invented something that's never been done before. I cannot, I have not invented notation. I have not invented an instrument. I have not radically reshaped the way people play their instruments. But I don't think I don't experiment. The experiments are more within my own perception of what I think my music should be. So in that sense, yes, I hope I'll always be experimenting and trying on different ideas and different techniques within my own work, but I can't and won't claim that I have done something that has, blazed a trail that no one has ever blazed before. I can't say that.
I mean, if we were talking about language, we could write an entire novel that doesn't use a new word, right? But
Sure.
it's organized in a way that is unique. There's a interesting question that came in. I'll tie this to the next one, is that if I were going to describe sort of stereotypical, like a cliche performance of experimental music, right? I would just have nothing but dissonance, right? Like there would be just dissonance everywhere. And you do have some dissonance in your work, but, I'm reaching for descriptions for it because I don't want to say it's balanced, but it feels like there is a counterweight to dissonance in your work. Or am I completely wrong about that?
No, I think that's fair. I tend to think about consonance and dissonance as kind of existing on a continuum, and consonance is this end, and constant dissonance would be on this end. And I'm rarely over here. I'm rarely, constantly aggressively dissonant. I'm somewhere in the middle, and then I can slide that continuum back and forth depending on the shape of the piece.
So there's a question that came in, which was, do you have a favorite instrument to compose for? Which was something that I wanted to ask, because in some of them, the instruments were picked ahead of time. And in Blur, I was thinking about how in that opening, I don't think I've ever heard a flute and a clarinet harmonize like that. It was a completely new sound to my ear. But you seem capable of composing for anything, but so do you have favorites? Or in getting your assignment, right, compose for these three, was that difficult or just something that you roll with?
Well, I think there are a couple things in that question. One is that a versatile composer has to try to roll with, lots of different scenarios. And so it would be a shame to turn down a commission because I didn't feel equipped to write for the clarinet, for example. And so, that doesn't mean that I can write for every single instrument or that I wouldn't have to do a lot of research for certain instruments.
Okay, yeah.
But in terms of instruments that are commonly written for, those three instruments were fair game, I thought, and it was an attractive combination to me. As far as favorite instruments, I'm a horn player, so I'm a sucker for a good horn part and like to write those for myself occasionally. It's a good thing I married a cellist because I love to write for the cello.
Yeah.
And I've really enjoyed the combination of cello and voice, which I've had the opportunity to write for a number of times in a number of different contexts. And for just two players, there are still so many colors and textures that you can explore, and I've loved that combination and going to do more of that.
Yeah, so in the first piece, in time lapse, it's 3 cellos, right? And I was really taken by the description that you had going into that. And so I do want to talk about the pandemic a little bit because of the effect that the pandemic has had on artists, on the artistic community, on the way that we seek out art, the way that we, consume it. And it just, I'm interested in how you took that on by composing something that didn't have to be synchronous. Can you talk about that a little bit and
Sure.
why you did that? It just seems that you seem to thrive under constraint. You work in small spaces and you like constraint in some way, and it felt like you were working in that medium.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I do think that working within preset parameters forces you to be resourceful with your material and with your ideas.
Yes.
And it forces you to fully examine what is available. And so that concept of here are cellists who want to play together, who cannot be together, how can I facilitate that? That was an attractive problem to try to solve. And the constraints are the technology is just not there yet for simultaneous collaboration online. And people have tried, and Zoom is improving and, with audio quality and all that, but it's still a wild card about every person's individual internet speed and all those things. And when those things are all interacting, it's just too unpredictable to do it synchronously for most people. And so that just, if that's not available, then what's the next best thing? And the next best thing was, well, let's give the performer something that they can play independently and that can be combined and layered upon itself in such a way that there's not really a wrong way to do that.
And don't worry, Zoom is a huge fan of the show.
Okay.
So they totally love it.
Sorry, Zoom.
No, it's okay. We have a running joke that we've alienated many sponsors in our programming. You referred to it as a problem that you had to solve, and so I'm interested in that. How long did it take you to solve that problem, or is it something where you say, okay, yeah, sure, I'll just do it this way, or how long does it take to think through a problem like that?
In that instant, it was relatively brief. It was a kind of a reassuring experience that I could remember how to write a thing because it, immediately post shutdown with the upheaval that caused, I was doing just about everything but trying to compose, and so the fact that I realized that it really, maybe in that instance, was as simple as writing one melody that could replicate itself across multiple players. That's really, it was just a couple of days off and on of crafting the melody and then deciding how it might relate to itself.
So that one melodic line was the start?
Yeah, and that's all the piece is that single melody, and it's just played as many times as there are players available, and so you could do that piece with 20 cellists if you wanted to, and then, that would change the scope of it and the feel of it, but it's designed to be that flexible because I didn't know in that moment how many cellists Brian Hazlett was trying to connect. So I just wanted to write something that was as flexible and adaptable as possible, and then he could use it however he wanted to.
It's great. I've listened to that piece over and over again. And there's this experimental art movement that I like, that I encountered in the written word it's called the Oulipo movement. It was French, but it's art by constraint. And the shortest word in English to use all the vowels is eunoia, which translates as beautiful thinking. And I've always tried to think of constraint that way, that if you're in no matter what the limitations are, and so I'm thinking of the pandemic, going back to the question that in adversity you can still produce beautiful things, and that there's kind of a duty to do that. I mean, were you feeling some like compulsion to succeed, to do that, to make?
Yeah, I did. And that was hard at first because I also simultaneously felt like I didn't have anything to say yet.
I frequently feel like that, and that's I'm with
Right.
you. Yeah.
Welcome to trying to create
Yes,
art.
hello.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was aware of some people around me, not physically around me, but sort of in my circle, my broader circle online and everything, where some people were almost treating the idea of the pandemic lockdown as, ooh, this is my artistry treat, and
Right.
I'm gonna produce so much stuff.
I'm
And
going to be Taylor Swift and release 3 albums.
Right, that kind of thing. And at first, I was comparing myself pretty negatively to folks who were immediately finding ways to
Sure.
be artistically productive, because I did not have that in me right away.
Yeah.
And even on our campus, when we were producing the daily distractions and things like that, I felt tremendously guilty for not contributing to that, but I could not think of anything
Yeah. Well,
that I felt that I
forgave
could
you.
think. I could not think of any valuable contribution to that in that moment, because I just wasn't in the right frame of mind.
Yeah.
But those were so important and so lovely to see everybody else doing it.
Yeah.
And it helped me to see people still continue to try to put beautiful things out into the
Yeah,
world.
it's been a struggle. When I think about COVID so far, that to me the dominant impulse wasn't to create; it was to consume. It was exactly the opposite. So I want to get back to some of the questions that have come in. And okay, here's a short one, because I really want to know the answer to this. Who is your dream person to compose for?
Oh my gosh.
I know. I knew this would be hard.
Oh, that's brutal. Oh my goodness.
And it doesn't even say it has to be a musician. It could be like Sylvester Stallone.
A concerto for Sylvester Stallone and orchestra. No. Well, I mean, I would love to do a concerto. So, big featured solo with an orchestra. And I would love to write that for a cellist, and I'm married to one.
Yeah. So you can try it out.
I'll write
right?
it for him. Yeah.
That's I mean, that's great. Like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll go with that.
Sounds good. Here's another nice one. I'm so inspired. This is what we were just talking about. I'm so inspired by your ability to create during the pandemic. Was it hard to compose with energy and humor and wit during the past year? And I'm going to pair this with a subsequent question, which is, how do you know when a piece is finished?
Okay. First of all, thank you. I feel grateful for the opportunities and the prompts to compose. Composing with humor, I wouldn't necessarily say that's what I've done for the past year, although humor has been part of my work in other contexts. The music, except for Zing Boom, which is mostly fast, the music that I wrote for Time Lapse, the music I wrote for Blur, this is slow, kind of searching music, and that seems to, it seemed to me to represent the time and the moment, and it was what was in me at the time.
I was hearing Time Lapse as mournful, but I was asking myself, because that was of the 3, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that was the one where the visuals are really cued to be in concert with the piece, and just somebody fading away at the end of that was really powerful and mournful. I don't mean that in a bad way.
Oh, sure. I think it was. I think we were all mourning the things that had been taken from us in
Yeah.
that time, you know? As for how I know a piece is done, it varies depending on the piece. Sometimes I know how I want to end a piece before I get to the end, and so it's just a matter of getting there. Other times I'm not sure until I get to the end, and I have to write a draft and write what I think is the end, and then walk away and then come back the next day and see if it still feels like the end. And oftentimes it's mostly the end, but I have to tweak it a little bit to make it really feel like I've said everything I need to say.
I mean, do you change when I'm thinking about something like jazz, where pieces grow and are reinterpreted and change over time, even by the same person. You know the podcast Song Exploder.
Oh, yeah.
And so I listened to the one with Cat Stevens where he played father and son, whatever, many years later, and it sounded completely different. And do you have any engagement with your pieces that way, where you would go back and change, that they would, I don't know if change is the right word, but interpret them differently?
Right. I have definitely revised older pieces, but I wouldn't say I have changed them to the degree that you're talking about.
Yep.
I have a piece, it's an older string quartet of mine that is going to be performed actually next week by the Weidner Philharmonic Quartet. And that piece I hadn't listened to since I first wrote it, which was 2006. I have pieces older than my child. It's strange, you know. But I went back and I still liked most of it, but there are things that I realized I could do more effectively now than I could in 2006. And so I tightened up some of the transitions and things to kind of just make it a little bit more cohesive. But it's not a profound change in the material. It's still basically the same piece, just improved a little bit.
At least you think it's improved.
I hope so.
Right. So I wanted to ask about form, because you work in a lot of different forms, and we'll get to film is something that I know that you have an interest in, but even though you showed excerpts of 3 pieces tonight, overall they're not that long. You are, when I think of composers, Beethoven and Mozart, I think of symphonies, and that the objective are these grand, large pieces. They're long. There are many people in them. You need to be in giant spaces to play them. You seem to be attracted to brevity, and the miniaturist ensembles. Can you articulate why that is? Like, what's the attraction?
Sure. There are a couple of things going on there. With miniatures, I'll start there. That's another example of working within constraint. And what I really like about a miniature is that you have to get to the point quickly, it's similar to thinking about a haiku, right? You only have so much space to convey, hopefully, a big idea. And if you can't do that efficiently, then you're not really using that form to its potential. So the idea of, can you create a universe using very limited materials, is just a really interesting challenge for me, and it's been really gratifying as we continue to do these miniatures concerts to see all the different approaches that different composers take to try to do that. The other part of the question, I'm sorry, remind me.
No, so actually, in saying that, it was why were you attracted to the form? But so if I were given a miniature assignment, right, and what you just described, and what you were saying about you only have so much time and you have to make this point, I would automatically fill it with as many notes and sounds as possible, right? But because I'm not great at that. So, but you have a lot of space in the pieces. There are pauses, there's silence, so even though you're working in an economy of form, there's still space that is used, but positively. Can you say something about that? Is that intentional?
Sure. Yeah. And I love deploying silence as a tool. I think it's important to allow an idea to sink in the ear of the audience. And it's something that when I go back, I'm working in draft form and trying to work through material. It's something I always have to go back and add more of, because I get impatient with the idea generation process, and I move in my drafts much too quickly from idea to idea. And I have to tell myself, no, slow down, because I've spent days, weeks, maybe months with these ideas, but a listener is going to hear it once if I'm lucky. And so it's the same thing as if you were giving a lecture and you wanted to make sure that your class understood what you were saying. You have to pause and check in and make sure that everything is cool and that you haven't blown past them. And so space, it's about the just the cognition part of listening to music, and about understanding and having a chance for that idea to resonate with the listener and mean something, so that if I use it again, then I'm building on that meaning. Yeah,
well, if you play a wind instrument, then you have to take a breath.
There's that too.
Right, so
people have to breathe.
Yeah, there's, metaphorically. I'm thinking when you said when you get an idea, like I'll write something down in a notebook, or I'll keep a piece of paper by the bed. And are you one of those people that it appears in a melody, so you're like shopping and then you pull out your phone and then you hum a melody into your phone?
I haven't really done that, although that's probably not a bad idea.
Oh, good. Yeah.
If I'm somewhere where I can't notate an idea, I will just try to keep playing it in my head until I can. I do have a little pocket notebook that I carry around, and when I haven't had the notebook with me, and I'm sure I've been busted by one of my colleagues in a faculty meeting, I'll like draw a staff if I have to be like, I gotta get this little idea down during this faculty meeting.
Absolutely.
Right. I'm sure I've been busted doing this, but
it's forgiven. Like you're really working, right? You're working during this time.
I'm working. Right? So you just have to try to capture ideas wherever they happen.
All right, here is another one, specific to Blur. So you mentioned changing ideas or instructions for composing Blur. Do you anticipate making a version of the piece that has different instructions if a group can be in the room together?
That's a really great question, and I hope that the trio, the Alma Ensemble, will play it live when they're able to. And I did construct the score to be very playable live. I had to put the flute and clarinet parts in a fixed relationship with each other so that I could give timings to the pianist and so that everything could coordinate. But in a live performance, there's space built into that score where the performers can make decisions in the moment about how long to hold a pause before moving on. And those are the kinds of things that can vary from venue to venue. If you have a really echoey hall, you might need to wait a little bit longer for that echo to clear. All those kinds of things that happen in live performance were things that were not available for the first performance because of the live stream and the space constraints. And so it exists in this fixed timing right now, but the score is such that it can be performed live, and the performers will have the flexibility to think about the arrangements of the parts themselves.
All right, so here, I'm gonna move to a big question. So just in your, I'm just gonna guess that you've spent a lot of time thinking about creativity and art during the pandemic, right? And what do you think if anything, the pandemic has taught people about art and their experience with it? I've been having conversations about this with people where one of my takes on this, and I think is right, is that art has literally saved people's lives during this pandemic, and that is, okay, that's one extreme way to look at it, but has this taught people anything about art? Or what has it taught you, maybe, if you don't want to speak for other people? So.
Right, I think we're going to be seeing the results of that question and different answers to that question as we emerge and as we see people start to re-engage with the arts and re-engage with live performance. It's taught me just how important of a role performance plays in my life, because I've certainly missed it. Having a performance goal to shoot for is a way of structuring my time that gives my time meaning and value.
Yep.
And without that, it was really easy to feel adrift and to kind of look at my horn that was sitting in a corner and say, I could practice, but
And
what
the
do I
fact-
have to practice for? You know?
And the fact that that horn was in this time seen as an object that could actually cause more harm than other objects. That if you were in a room, that was an amplified way to potentially hurt other people, which is a strange association to have with this thing that you love.
Right,
You know?
right. You know, and not to and think about how that must feel for singers whose very voice was seen as a weapon. You know, like, oh God, like how could that be? So it was a really disconcerting way to think about the things that we do, and I hope, as far as, I mean, if there's anything that I can kind of hopefully predict for this period as we're starting to reemerge, I hope that people are as hungry to experience live performance as musicians are to provide it.
Yeah.
Because every musician that I've talked to has just can't wait to play again.
You know,
and I hope the audiences come for us.
I think that's a real, before the pandemic, I think people generally like to joke about how they hate being around other people, or I'm an introvert, I just want to stay home. And that's okay, but I think there really is that hunger that you're talking about. And, one of the things that I've been thinking about is how listening to other people talk about the pandemic in certain contexts, like you and I work in education, right? And I hear people talk about this pandemic like they understand it already in the moment. And so, okay, now going forward, what have we learned? And obviously these things are going to be different, right? This is because of the pandemic and we have devices, the future of this is obviously this. And in thinking about the pieces that you presented tonight and how time is such an influence in them, in the composition process, I was thinking about space, though, and how if there's anything that the pandemic has really got me thinking about is in opposition to his statement that this is all so much more efficient because, look, we're at home and we all have our devices and we don't have to travel. And I guess I struggle with I'm not struggling with it. I know that efficiency and convenience are not synonymous. So thinking about space your performances and music has helped me think through this, is that it's really led us to an inefficiency of space, that where we would have 12 people in a room just at a meeting, they're in 12 different rooms, powered by 12 whatever light bulbs and the energy and the laptops and the power use, and we're not really thinking about space that way. And does that apply to music at all? Or you pulled off what you wanted to pull off beautifully, right? But it's still like an inefficient use of space that we don't, because I could see somebody saying, this is my new art form, music at a distance, right? And how do you feel about that? This is a very rambling thought that I threw out there. Please forgive me.
No,
Okay.
I'm following. It's all good.
Oh, good. All right.
Yeah. No, I don't aspire to become an expert at solving these problems.
Yes.
Right. I think that, I called, when I needed to give a title for this talk, what I called it was the next best thing. And that's because I do think the best thing, when possible, is that we have a communal experience and we have that energy exchange among the musicians and between the musicians and the audience. And there's nothing that can replace that in my mind. Does that mean that there's no room for music making at a distance? No, not at all. Does that mean that we should stop live streaming? No, because there's some great new points of access that we can provide to all kinds of folks who, for various reasons, find it difficult to come to a live performance. So
Right.
I would like to see us do both and try to figure out what are the best ways to serve an audience and what are the best ways to also serve a live stream audience, and to make that a valuable experience for everybody. That if I aspire to solve any problem, that's the next problem I aspire to try to solve, is how do we continue to reach audiences who physically can't be with us while welcoming audiences who can be with us.
It feels to me like in the time of disruption that there is something in the discourse that makes us not want to admit that human contact is important, you know. And I was thinking, like a lot of people have said over the years, well, we don't need to go to the movies anymore, right? And I can't tell you how much I've missed going to the movies.
I miss the movies.
I mean, come on.
I miss it so much. Yeah.
It's just the lack of the. Okay, let me pivot, if I could use a disruption word. Let me pivot for a second.
Sure thing.
Moving from short pieces to some larger things, one of the things you've done is score for film. And one, I want to know like what the attraction to that is. And I'm just thinking about it. I'm reading a biography of Shostakovich and just noticing how many composers in a certain time in the 20th century, like this is how they made money, like going to play live while films were playing. I'm not saying that's why you're doing that. So what is attractive to you about that as an artistic endeavor?
For the first one I did, which was Metropolis.
That was the first one?
That was the first
That's
one.
like a huge successful thing. Okay, right.
But that was the first film that I approached, and part of it was one of those, you know, wow, here's a mountain I could climb, and I was a little, that was part of the appeal. That film in particular has this long and strange history of multiple scores having been attached to it, in part because the first score that went with the first screenings of it was lost for a really long time. And so to solve that problem, a number of people provided new scores. And the interesting problem to solve was, you know, how do I take this film that is really strange but is so visually compelling? How can I contribute to that and work in collaboration with that? Even though collaboration maybe isn't the right word, because here's this fixed element.
Yep.
This film isn't going to change, and I don't have to ask anybody what they think while I'm putting music to it, which is not the standard arrangement when you're scoring for film.
That's kind of like what ekphrastic art is, right? Like the writing poems about paintings, or you're creating this thing about this pre-existing thing.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to do that?
To do Metropolis?
Yeah.
I started writing in earnest in June of the year before it was performed in April. So I wrote from June through December, and I had this, and the only way I was able to get through it was to say, okay, how many minutes do I have left in the score? And I was dividing that number of minutes by the number of weeks I had to finish it by December 1st. And then how many minutes per day do I have to account for in my score? And so as long as I hit my daily target, then I was gonna get to the end. So it was, 6 days a week of writing at least a minute or two of music to make that deadline. And then I had to go back through a second time because I did it in what's called short score. I didn't account for all of the instruments all at once. I wrote the material and then I had to orchestrate it. But since the material was already written, that process was shorter.
So when you get to the end of that, is it a single art form? You know, is it a single art form, or is it the combination of these two? And I don't know why I'm asking that. Like, it
Right.
could be both, I guess, but
I think it can be both, but I also see the distinction, because if I had worked with a filmmaker and we created a unified project together in collaboration, that is a different thing than me writing a score for a film that already exists. And that film will still exist without my score.
yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and so there is a distinction to be made, but I hope that what I added to it made for a unified experience.
I mean, I can't tell. Like, so if you were going to tell me that I had the opportunity to go see all the Star Wars movies with a live orchestra performing, I would pay about anything.
Yeah.
I would become an indentured servant just to do that.
Right.
You know. So I think we're about at the end. So I want to, like, what's one last thing that you can say to the people who are watching, you know, about art, about, I mean, there are people that are watching this right now that are creators, and they want to make things, and it's been so challenging, not just in the ability to do it, but to even think about things other than the thing, right? So what can you say to solve everyone's problems?
I will do my best.
Yes.
I will say what I have said to myself periodically during this time, and what I've said to some of my composition students at different points, which is that things are hard, and they're gonna stay hard for a little while longer, although I hope we're coming out of it. And that if we're lucky, we can use creative work as a way to find solace and try to make some kind of meaning out of this time, and to make this time matter. And that even if we can't be doing all of the things we would like to be doing, maybe we can plant the seeds for things that will come to fruition later.
You had said you had sent me sort of a write-up of what you were going to talk about, and how silence was sort of unacceptable. And if there's what I've learned from listening to your work, which has been a really great experience for me. It's fantastic. And I'm not doing it justice in saying that, but it made me think about silence, right? That to kind of rethink what the opposite of silence was. And you helped me like move to a position where the opposite of silence isn't noise. It could be music, that the opposite of silence could be art. And that's a really hopeful thing, I think. Or does that sound really dramatic?
No,
Okay.
I like that. And I think another way to say something similar would be that the opposite of silence would be engagement in some way. And so just by being part of a community of sharing ideas, or watching a performance and commenting on it and being part of that energy exchange in this modified way, that's another alternative to silence and giving up.
Michelle, thank you so much for being here. This has been great.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Now, let me put on my glasses.
All right.
So thank you for joining us this evening. If you've liked what you heard and would like more, an extended version of this interview will be available online in the near future. We call that No Reservations After Dark, is sort of our tagline for that. Our next discussion is with Dr. Kim Riley, who's in our Democracy and Justice Studies program, on politics and mass consumer culture on May 4th, same time, 6:30 p.m. Central Time, via the Weidner Center's YouTube page. For more information about this or all of our talks, visit causeeffect.org, and that's CAHSSEFFECT. So again, thank you so much for being with us, and Michelle, again, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yep.